And so I'm going to stop talking because you don't want to hear me speak, and we're going to turn things over to our keynote speaker, Sarah Rudd. So Sarah, if you can come on down. Sarah is a pioneer in modern football analytics. In a prior life, she worked for Microsoft as a software developer, studied environmental science and computer science at Columbia University, and earned an MBA from University of Washington. But then she published arguably a seminal foundational paper in soccer analytics on pass value, joined a company, StatDNA. He headed their analytics and software development. This was acquired by Arsenal in 2012, where she spent the next decade leading Arsenal's analytics department, one of the most successful in the world of football. And now she is currently the CTO and co-founder of Source Football. So we're really grateful to have Sarah Rudd here to talk about her career and her work at Source. So let's join in the bank.
Can everyone hear me?
Is it on?
Of course, it starts at the end. All right, yeah, thanks Ron, thanks everyone for having me here. I'm pretty excited to be here. I've heard really great things about this conference, but this is the first time I've been able to attend. Currently live in Houston, Texas, so coming to Pittsburgh in November is kind of a scary thing for me, but really happy that the weather's kind of holding up and I'm not too cold. But I do realize it's kind of early on a Saturday morning, so I'm gonna just try to keep things a little bit light. But yeah, as Ron said, I'm the current CTO of Source Football, but kind of better known for being head of Arsenal's data analytics department for close to a decade. So I thought I'd just kind of talk a little bit about my background, how I got here. It's not easy breaking into the sports industry, so I've always found it really useful to kind of hear about other people's experiences, how they did it, because everybody's journey is a little bit different. And then I'll talk a little bit about what I'm up to now and kind of why I made that change and why I think it's fun and interesting. So a little bit of background about myself. Is that better? Okay, how's this? A little better? Okay, so a little bit of background about myself. I grew up outside of Boston. Boston is a fantastic sports city, so I think if you're gonna get into sports analytics, being a really passionate sports fan is probably one of the prerequisites. So yeah, it was really great growing up there. When I was a kid, they were in the finals every single year. They lost every single year, or almost every single year, which was good and bad. I mean, I think it kind of damaged my psyche as a human being, but it also kind of made me hungry to win, because it was something that was really lacking. My mom is from the Bronx, so that added another kind of fun element to this. So the Red Sox-Yankees rivalry. All right, is this better? Okay, perfect. So my mom's from the Bronx, so the Red Sox-Yankees rivalry, we got to live that kind of every day of my life. Everyone on my mom's side of the family is a Yankees fan, except for my brother and I, who were born north of Hartford. And one of the cool things about my mom being a Yankees fan, she grew up during the Mickey Mantle era, so she had every single Yankees yearbook from 1956 to 1969. So what this means is that I had kind of baby's first data set where I got to look at kind of Yankee statistics from 1955 to 1968. So as a small child living in cold New England, I'd spend my winter days just looking at tables and tables of data. So kind of predisposed to this career in sports analytics. But really my passion has always been soccer. I'm gonna call it football I'll kind of switch back and forth, but know that when I say football, I mean soccer. But yeah, like ever since I was a kid, I just absolutely loved it, even though I didn't really have a lot of access to it. So growing up, there was no Major League Soccer. There was no National Women's Soccer League. Having a career in professional soccer, even like as a player, was not something I could dream of, because it just didn't exist to me. I wasn't really aware of like what was going on in Europe or South America, really every country except for the US. So to me, soccer was just something I loved, but really nothing more. And to kind of like show you like how obsessed I was with it, I recently watched Karate Kid. So it's a great movie. If you haven't watched it, it's old. But rewatching it, I remember how excited I was for this like one scene in the movie. And it's not like the crane kick or anything like that. It's when Daniel practices soccer, right? And so this is like how deprived I was of soccer in my life, is that I would get excited that like it was just one scene in a movie. So I didn't really like plan on working in professional sports or soccer. Had a normal rest of my childhood, but then when I went off to undergrad, decided to major in environmental science. And so this is the sort of thing that I would look at all the time while I was studying. And the reason I have this picture up there is that when I start working for Arsenal, we start doing sort of, 2D heat maps on the soccer pitch. People started calling them weather maps. They say, "Hey, Sarah, can you do that weather map for this upcoming match?" And I'd say, like, what are you talking about? Like, we're not predicting like how warm it's going to be or anything like that. But to them, they just saw kind of like the colors and they thought it was a weather map. So yeah, studying environmental science can help you with a career in sports analytics if you ever want to produce weather maps, I guess. So went to college in New York. And so this was kind of the first time that I actually had access to watching soccer on a regular basis. My cousin was in the Bronx. He would call me up and say, "Hey, Sarah, like, let's meet on 23rd Street. We'll go watch Arsenal in the morning." And I was like, "Yes, please." So if you saw how excited I was to watch Karate Kid, imagine how excited I was that I could actually watch this every day. And it's not like now where you could just kind of like stay in your dorm room, watch it early in the morning. Like you actually had to go to a bar, pay for it. So it was still really difficult, but at least I started to be able to watch it. And so this kind of like passion and love just started growing more and more and more. So when I graduated, wasn't really sure what I wanted to do in life. I was also a dual computer science major, so I started working for some startups and it was nice. But now I start thinking about like, okay, how can I get into working in soccer? And so still like sports analytics wasn't on my roadmap. I don't think Moneyball had even come out yet as a book, and I wasn't really plugged into what Bill James and everyone was doing. So I was like, maybe I can get in on the business side. And so I learned about a program in England where you could do an MBA specifically for the football industry. And I thought about it, but I realized it wasn't a good fit for me. I didn't really study business. I really had no desire to study business. And then it was like a very like specific niche degree. And I was like, well, what if I hate every bit of this? Then I'm kind of stuck with a degree that it isn't really going to be useful back in the US when people would be like, why did you study soccer? So I decided not to do that program. And so the next kind of step was what anyone would do, which is quit your job, move to South America, go live on a beach. And so this was awesome because now it wasn't just watching the Premier League. I could watch Spanish League, German League, Argentinian League, Chilean League. I could play like 5 times a week. It was awesome. It was amazing. And then this picture is actually from the first World Cup qualifier I ever went to outside of the US. So Chile tied Brazil with like a 89th minute penalty. It was like absolutely amazing. This moment in time actually ended up being my MBA grad school admissions essay topic. This just kind of like changed my life where I was like, I need to be a part of this. Like, I love this so much. It hurts. I need to be a part of it. But I still didn't really know like how to make that jump. And I think one of the really difficult things for me was that at this time, when I looked at like who had the jobs that I wanted, it was all people who were former athletes or relatives of former athletes. I don't meet any of that criteria. So I was still kind of at a loss, like how can I make this transition? So I decided to move to Seattle. A friend of mine called me up. She said, "Hey, we just moved here. We don't have any friends. Why don't you come join us?" my husband works for Microsoft. It's pretty cool. You should do this. And I was like, oh, okay, why not? Like, I'll definitely learn a lot. It'll be fun, and it seems like a nice place to live. And as you can see, it's like absolutely beautiful, fantastic place to live. Yeah, just unbelievable. And working at Microsoft was, yeah, kind of like a really unique experience. Like, I'd never had a desire to work for like a massive tech company. So when I was there, it was 100,000 employees. It's just like unfathomable. But you get to do cool things like, you know, the first project I work on was with the guy who invented pivot tables for Excel. And like, you don't get that opportunity in a lot of places. So that's like pretty cool. And so I ended up working for Bing, which is their search engine. So it was a really cool kind of exposure to like big data. And I laugh because in Spanish, they call football analytics big data, even though like most of what they're doing can fit in Excel. But this was actual big data. And then a lot of the technology that we're using turned into a lot of the Azure offerings now. So like we had our own MapReduce system. A lot of the Cosmos stuff got productized into Azure. So that was really cool. But after about a year or two of being at Microsoft, like that bug of like, how do I get to football? How do I get to football is like really getting bad because Seattle has like great football culture. I could play, 5 times a week. Like everybody was just obsessed with the sport, which made things worse for me. So at the time, my best friend there, he said, hey, I'm going to do this like part-time MBA program at University of Washington. What do you think? Like, do you want to do that with me? And at this point, I was like, okay, maybe that seems like a better fit for me than the MBA program I had been considering before, where, worst case scenario, if I don't break into the football industry, at least I have kind of like a respectable generic degree that's not so specialized. Microsoft will pay for a little bit of it, so I don't have to take out student loans. I can work while I'm doing it. So all of this seemed really good. And then I was like, okay, well, I'm in the Pacific Northwest. We have Nike, we have Adidas here. Like, if I can't get a job with a team directly, maybe that's an alternate path for me, where I can work on kind of like the football product lines and get my foot in the door that way, and then maybe transition over. So it seemed like a really good, cool opportunity for me. One of the cool things about it that I didn't realize is like when you're a student, you get all these kind of like opportunities to talk to kind of like smart, busy, important people, because they're more willing to talk to students than they are just like a random person who emails them. So once I became a student, I decided to kind of like think about, well, like who do I know in the industry that I can talk to? And I was really fortunate that the president of US Soccer at the time was a teacher where I did my undergrad. So I could get his email address really easily. I looked him up, I sent him a note, I said, this is who I am, this is what I want to do. What advice do you have for me? And he was really nice. He said, give me a call during office hours, we'll chat. We chatted for, half hour, 45 minutes. And he goes, best way to get your foot in the door? Ticketing. And I was like, oof, like, I don't like talking to people. I don't like selling things. I am, though, like a developer at Microsoft. Like, I have these technology skills. Like, doesn't seem like a great fit. And he said, okay, well, if you're in Seattle and you like technology, you should talk to this guy, Adrian Hanauer. He owns the Seattle Sounders. They're going to get an MLS team next year. I think you guys will really hit it off. So I go and I look up Adrian, chat with him. And kind of like the first words out of his mouth are, have you read Moneyball? Do you know who Shane Battier is? Like, can we do this in soccer? And I was like, whoa, like totally taken off guard because I knew about all that stuff by this point, but I'd never kind of like thought about putting them together because we didn't have data, or so I thought. So I kind of left that meeting like really blown away. I was like, okay, like this seems like a much better fit between what are my skills, what are my interests. So at that point, it's like, okay, let me kind of like look around, see what data I can get my hands on. So one thing leads to another. End up working for Arsenal. Also, while I was at Microsoft, I met my husband. So he and I would literally have lunches together and say, wouldn't it be cool if we could like leave Microsoft and go work in professional football? We both managed to do it. He's not so bad himself. He ended up actually working for Adrian. I never did, but my husband did, which is kind of cool. And he was pretty successful. He probably has the kind of like biggest fan group of any data analytics person at a championship parade I've ever seen. But yeah, this is pretty cool. And like the coolest thing about this photo, I think, as well, is that it's actually taken by the head coach of the Sounders. So it wasn't taken by Robbie, it was taken by the head coach, which is pretty cool. All right, but so I kind of like skipped over step 1, do your MBA, step 3, go work for your favorite football team. So how did I actually get there? And so this paper was kind of like fundamental and foundational for how I actually ended up breaking into the industry. So again, being a student, not only do people talk to you, but you can get really cheap tickets to MIT Sloan. So I got like a $75 student ticket, so you can tell I'm old because that was a really long time ago. Now they cost much, much more than that. But I was able to go the first year they had any sort of soccer content. So they had a football and football panel. So you can tell the kind of state of the industry where we only got half of a panel at Sloan, so there wasn't really a lot going on. But I was able to talk to one of the panelists. His name was Mike Ford. He was working at Chelsea at the time. And I said, this is who I am. This is what I want to do. What advice do you have for me? And he actually gave me really good advice. He said, look, football clubs, sports teams in general, they are inundated with resumes from people who claim that they can do what we want them to do. It's really hard to process that. It's a lot easier if you can show the football team what you can actually do. And so I thought this was really good advice. And so I came away from that and I was like, all right, now's the time to get my hands dirty with the data. Like, let me get, whatever data I can get my hands on, play around with it, and just kind of like start making progress on that so that hopefully someday I can have something to show to somebody, get my foot in the door, and get a job that way. I just started scraping the web, like any sort of data source I could. A lot of it was really, really basic information, number of shots and shots on target in a game, which is like, kind of like not even football analytics 101. But the really cool thing is that shortly after that, a company called StatDNA reached out to me and they said, hey, we're doing a research competition. We collect our own event level data. We're going to give it to people and then have you write a research paper on it. And, we'll choose a winner and you get to speak at the New England Symposium for Statistics in Sports. And I thought, wow, this is exactly the opportunity I've been waiting for, where I'm going to learn a lot entering this contest. And either I'm going to win or I'm going to lose, and I'm going to learn a lot from the people who did win. So there was really like no downside to doing this. And so, I thought about what Mike said, and I thought, okay, I'm going to come up with a problem, and then I'm going to try to solve it. And, so I listened to Doug's keynote last year, and he mentioned that he was really proud that he had come up with like a cool name for a metric called strokes added in golf, I believe. I don't have that skill, clearly, because this is like a garbage name of something. I don't even remember like why I did this, but it's basically like a pass value model or an event value model. But fortunately, like a couple years after me, a really nice gentleman by the name of Karun Singh came along. Different methodology, kind of same idea, and he coined this expected threat, or XT, which is like a much better name. But really what it is it's trying to value how much does an individual player kind of like shift the odds of their teams scoring a goal. So I actually, I cringe a little bit with that paper. It gets cited a lot. But when I look back at it, I'm like, oh, why did I do this? Why did I do that? Like, there's so many things like I wish I had done differently. But in preparing for this talk, I kind of looked over the slides that I had done for Nessus. And so this was the first slide, which is, what are we trying to solve? And I'm actually like really proud that at that point in time, that was my mentality of like, let's focus on a problem, come up with a solution, show value to the club that way. And I don't necessarily agree with like what I put down here, except for the last one. I think this is really the crux of the value of what I did, which is, can we quantify how much a player contributes to creating good goal scoring opportunities? And what's crazy is that at this point in time, like, I don't know how many people in here are familiar with expected goals, but creating good goal scoring opportunities, like, we didn't even know how to do that at the time. Like, expected goals was not publicly available. So this was pretty, I guess, like, foundational, I guess, which is, yeah, like why it resonated with people. I presented this, StatDNA ended up hiring me. So that's how I got my foot in the door. And then, the funny part is, day one I show up and they're like, oh yeah, we already have that model. We just implemented it differently. So I guess that kind of like showed me the difference between public work and private work. But yeah, if there's like one take home I want to have for you guys today, it's really like focus on problems and solutions. And this kind of seems obvious, but I think when you're working particularly in like a club environment or club setting, a lot of times you can get distracted and move away from this. And the reason why I have I'm curious about ... at the top and have it crossed out isn't because I say, or I want to say like, don't be curious. I think everybody in this room is here because they are curious. It certainly has gotten me pretty far in my career of being curious about certain things, but you need to have that balance and make sure that like, I'm going to be curious about the right things. The other thing about like this phrase, I'm curious about ... is that it's now become the phrase that when I hear it, my heart kind of like sinks. I'm like, oh, not this again. So the reason for that is that, okay, a lot of sports analytics conferences, they talk about like, oh, to be successful, you got to really like build relationships, build trust, like get buy-in from everybody. 100% agree. Like that is very, very important. What they don't talk about is what happens after. What happens after you build that trust? And I will tell you what happens after. You deliver some sort of analysis. The coaching staff loves it. They're like, great, that was so thankful. The next day they knock on your door and they say, hey, that was really like useful. I'm curious about ... And they're going to be curious about something that isn't really going to influence or change any decision that they make. They're literally just curious, like, oh, I just want to know this. And so now you're stuck in the situation of, I want to maintain that relationship, because it's not that you build relationships and then abandon them. You want to maintain that relationship. You want to keep them happy. But it's going to take me a lot of time to answer and deliver this analysis that they're asking for. And there's a huge cost to that. The cost is my time, but then also the opportunity cost of I could have been working on something more important that's going to move the needle, that's going to change how decisions are made. And so that's why I think this is really important to like make sure that you're focusing on problems and solutions and not just like, I'm curious about this or that. All right, so whatever the sneakerhead equivalent is for football boots, that's me. I'm still waiting for somebody to invite me to do a keynote speech on football boots and the evolution. But in the meantime, I'm gonna just use them as an analogy for how kind of sports evolves and things have changed. So when you work at a place for 10 years and then you decide to leave, pretty natural to think about like, oh, how were things back when I started? How am I leaving them? And I think a lot of times when I personally think about how are sports evolving, I think of like, oh yeah, back in the 50s, they had this like big, heavy leather ball, literally wore boots. That's why they're called football boots. But now we're in like the modern era. And that's not really the case. Like, it's not like, oh, back then it was this, now it's changed and we're modern. There's still a lot of evolution that happens on like really small timeframes. So this is an evolution of a football boot called the Adidas Predator. It's my personal favorite football boot. I loved playing in these. And at the time that they came out, they weren't great. They were kind of heavy, clunky, and they had these, they're called vamps, but like it's these little bits of little bits of rubber that are all over kind of like the front of the shoe. And the idea is like, if you hear of like bend it like Beckham, you get more kind of friction between your shoe and the ball, so you get more rotation, more spin. So that was kind of like the problem they were trying to solve. And these weren't great, but they were better than what was out there. So this is like, yeah, it's like a marginal improvement of what was out there. But then over time, like things start to change. So in the late 90s, they get like this really nice kangaroo leather. And not to talk too much about football boots, but kangaroo leather is really nice because it's a little bit stretchy, so you can get like a really nice fit. But it's also very sturdy, so you can cut it thinner. So you get like more touch, more sensation between your foot and the ball than if you're using like a thick cow leather. They also started kind of like refining where they were putting the vamps, so not all over the toe, but being like a little bit more like optimized on where they put it, because you do lose like a little bit of that touch if the whole front of your shoe is covered in leather. And then they added this like iconic red tongue to it. So the idea is like cover your laces so you get like a cleaner surface to strike the ball. So they're really kind of thinking about like, how can we get a good fit? How can we get clean striking surface? How can we get bend on the ball? And so, you know, they're moving in the right direction now. Like, this is really great. And then in 2002, they released the Predator Mania. So to me, this is like the absolute perfect football boot. If anyone has watched the David Beckham documentary on Netflix, this is what he was wearing when he scores the iconic free kick against Greece to send England to the 2002 World Cup. He was using the lunar white colorway, not this one, but same boot. But anyways, to me, this is perfect. And so what does Adidas do when they have the perfect football boot? They have to keep innovating. Why? Because there's kind of internal and external pressures to keep evolving. So it's not like they could say, hey, we made the perfect football boot, we're gonna stop, because Nike and Puma are gonna keep going. They're gonna keep pushing things. And then, you know, if you stop making new football boots, people stop buying them or buy them in smaller quantities. They also wanna drive down costs. So they start kind of like changing things, and I would say not for the better. So there's less leather on the boots so that they can save money. But then they kind of like make these changes that I don't understand. Feels like it was like change for change's sake. But the worst one I would say is like these power insoles. So what these were like weights you could put in your boot so that you could, you know, strike the ball harder. And kind of like, okay, maybe that makes sense. But if you think about like, what do you do during a soccer game? Like a typical soccer game maybe has like between 10 and 25 shots per team. So like an individual is only gonna get a few shooting opportunities, not all of them with your feet. And then certainly not all of them are like, let me put my laces through this, kick it as hard as I can. Like you're gonna want to put spin on it, maybe it's a tap in, things like that. And then those kind of like typical like power shots we know now, like particularly from long range, aren't very good. And not because you're not getting enough power on it, but because one, it's hard to keep the ball down. There's a lot of defenders between you and the goal that can deflect or block the shot. Goalkeeper has much more time to react. So like these are not good opportunities. What do you do a lot of in a soccer game? You run. You run on average 10 to 12 kilometers a game. And so, you know, my husband is a runner. When he runs 10K, I've never heard him say, I want heavier shoes. Like, nobody says that. So to me, this was like a horrible idea. But they keep going, making changes. And I think now, like, I never got to play in these. I had to unfortunately give up playing from too many concussions. But now I think they're in a pretty good spot where they've solved, I think, a lot of the problems they were trying to do before, where they don't actually have any leather at all, but they're still able to get like this really great fit because the synthetic uppers are a lot better. They're much more lightweight now. And then, hey, if you don't have laces, you don't need a tongue. And so that's how they kind of like solve that problem now. So pretty cool. So how does that relate to kind of like my career and Arsenal and everything? Well, actually, sorry. So a few takeaways before that. So, you know, I want to kind of like use this analogy to just highlight a few things. So things are changing a lot faster than you realize. So that was over 23 years, but really you could kind of take like a snapshot. So I think it's really important to not get lost too much in the weeds of like the day-to-day, but continuously kind of take a step back, revisit, how are you working? What are you working on? Is this the best way? Are there kind of like new things I can take advantage of? The other thing which I think is really important for sports in particular is that change keeps happening, innovation keeps happening. And I think one of the things I'm really curious about now is, you know, obviously we all want to figure out how to build winning teams, winning cultures. But one of the problems I think hasn't been solved is how do you sustain that? And I think that's really hard. So in sports, you know, whatever competitive advantage you have, people are going to try to copy that. You know, the environment in which you are operating is going to change, but then a big problem or big challenge, I would say, is that there's a lot of ego in sport. I don't know if you guys know that. But when you win, what happens? Everybody's egos swell. And, you know, everyone starts to think like, well, we won because of me. And like, guys, like literally it's a team sport. Like we won because of all of us. But that's like a hard challenge to kind of have, is like, how do you kind of navigate all of those different challenges to kind of sustain this winning culture? And then the last point is that, like, hopefully everything is kind of like trending in the right direction with a lot of these changes. But there's going to be a lot of distractions or a lot of things that kind of like are a step backwards, actually, just like those power insoles. So I think there's like a lot of advantage you can gain by being able to kind of navigate away from those, avoid those, or minimize those. So how does that kind of relate back to my career and my time at Arsenal? So when I started, the whole world was event data. We were an event data provider, and we didn't even have historical data. So like, you couldn't even talk about building predictive models because you had no way to evaluate them because you didn't have historical data. So that was kind of our world. And then this is how decisions were made. So if you don't know, this dapper gentleman in the middle, his name is Arsene Wenger. He was the manager of Arsenal for, I think, 22 years. He's also the last manager to build a team, manage them, and go undefeated for an entire Premier League season. So like, wildly successful human being. But his title was manager. And as an American, that's a little bit confusing because, in baseball, you have managers. This is not the same. This is the role of like a baseball manager plus baseball general manager. So not only is he responsible for coaching the first team, but literally everything on the sporting side. So the grounds crew report to him, all the physio, medical staff, everything. So he's got to deal with coaching the team, running practice, but then also like signing players, thinking about budget. And it's like an insane way to operate. But back then we didn't really have a lot of data or information. So it was really just get into a room with scouts with data. We kind of both present our case. He takes that information in, weights it however he wants, and then makes a decision. And so that's how we were kind of operating. Kind of at the early days. Later on, we went from event data, league tracking data, GPS, broadcast tracking, it just gets on and on and on. So there's a lot more data sources, a lot more information, right? Like, it's not just from the data side, but from all kind of avenues, there's a lot more information coming in. So when Wenger leaves, they decide maybe this isn't like the best model to have one human being responsible for like all of this. This is kind of getting to be too much. So they go with like a sporting director role. So this is Edu Gaspar. He's the sporting director of Arsenal right now. So he's responsible for everything at the training ground except for managing the first team. So slightly less responsibility, but still a lot. And so how does he make decisions? Well, he's got to kind of like balance all of this stuff. And to make it more fun, now he has a manager telling him what he wants to do. I want to sign this player. This is how I want to play. We need this guy, sell this guy, right? So it's really hard. And it's especially hard if you don't have a good process in place for kind of like figuring out what's valuable, what's not, what's my hierarchy of information. So that's kind of where we are in football right now, which is, it's difficult. So just kind of like a high-level overview, where were we when I started? This wasn't like the romantic upstart, underfunded Oakland A's investing in this for their survival. This was really investment by the largest clubs. So it would be like the Red Sox, Yankees, Dodgers being like, let's do this. But like, if it works, it works. If it doesn't, like, who cares? So there's a lot of competitive advantage with low-hanging fruit there, because you could just make better decisions than other people, because they weren't making decisions based on data or information. But the culture wasn't there. And there's kind of like a famous story where the manager says to one of the early analysts, like, oh, that's all well and good, but a game's not played on a laptop, mate. So that's kind of where we were. We're not there now. So now I would say, like, in terms of like who's using data and analytics within football, it's as low as it can go in terms of like, if there is a data provider covering the 5th Division of England, there's going to be a team in the 5th Division of England looking at this, which is like really cool. And there's also like a lot better tools out there where a team on whatever budget can go out into the market and say, I want to buy this platform and get like basic information on people. What's missing is like still, how do we use this to make better decisions and also faster decisions? Because you're not competing against 25 other teams. You're competing against the whole world when you're trying to sign a player. So getting to them first is really important. So what are some of the big challenges that are facing clubs? There's a new data source every day. A lot of companies are trying to get into this market. Global football is huge. You're not limited to the 29 or 26 teams in North America. Your marketplace is the whole world, literally thousands of teams. And so as somebody inside a club, you don't have any time to validate or assess. Like, is this data source good? Should we use it? Do we have the time and money to switch to using it? But then the flip side is you get all this pressure to be cutting edge, particularly if you're at a big club. So we were recently talking to a team in Mexico and we said, what data sources are you using? And they said, all of them. And they were really proud of this. And, we're just kind of looking at each other and we're like, we know there's a ton of redundant data sources in there. So you're paying for stuff that you're not using. But then some poor data engineer has had to go and hook up the API to all of this so that it can just sit there, because there's no way people are going to be actually leveraging all of these data sources. The competition is getting smarter. So, if you're a team in the 5th division of England, you're no longer competing against ignorant Luddites. Sure, there are some of those out there still, but people at least have basic information about a player. And I think the football analytics industry is really good at figuring out who's a good player now. I mean, how good they'll be in 5 years or when they switch is debatable, but it's really easy to generate a list of who are the best players in the market for the financial parameters that I have. So everyone has very similar lists. So that makes it really hard. One of the other big problems, so if you are a team that's behind, how do you catch up? Teams like Arsenal, Liverpool, City, they've been working on this for a decade. A lot of IP already built. And then if you're ahead, how do you stay ahead? That's the other one that's quite difficult. So I know at least in Arsenal, you have a decade worth of IP. You also have a decade worth of technical debt, which is a dirty secret nobody ever talks about. So yeah, that's difficult. And then I think another really big one is who's responsible for building something sustainable. So a lot of times we see clubs with 1, maybe 2 analysts. They're not getting any sort of support from leadership in terms of what's our vision, what should we build. Certainly a technical director isn't going to know what version control is or a server. So nobody's really making sure of oh, is this code being checked in somewhere that we can have access to it if you get hit by a bus or if your laptop dies. So yeah, I think that's a real big issue. And then, another one that I don't have great solutions to, but this isn't baseball, this isn't even basketball or NFL. We have real data limitations that makes our lives really difficult. So to kind of bring this home, the NWSL is a 12-team league. They play 22 matches. So that's the whole league. The data set is 132 matches, not one team, not one player. So the max that you could get for a player is 22 observations, which is just not enough. But really, I think that the biggest problem is we have all this information now. How are we actually translating that into better decision making? That I think is probably the biggest issue facing clubs right now. All right, so time to transition a little bit. I don't have much time. Talking a little bit about Source Football and what we're doing. So when I left Arsenal, I called up a friend. I said, look, it's time for me to do something different. I've been here for a long time. I feel like I'm stagnant. What are some of the good opportunities out there that I should be considering? And he said, no. That's the wrong approach. You figure out what you want to do and then find the opportunity that will fit that the best. And I was actually surprised when he asked me that. I was like, well, I don't know what I want to do. I don't want to work at another club because I've already done that. I've worked at my favorite club with huge amount of resources. Why would I go and kind of try to re-implement the same thing somewhere else, but do all the boring work and start from scratch? That didn't sound fun. So I made this list, and it's well, what do I want to do? First and foremost, work with good people. If you don't have this, doesn't matter. At least for me personally, I'll never be happy if I'm not working with good people. And this is something you should just never compromise on. I wanted to learn and I wanted to grow. So being at Arsenal, or really any place for a decade, you kind of get comfortable, you get a little bit stagnant, and then Arsenal is also a great club, so people don't tend to leave. So now you're working with the same people, and so there aren't like a lot of fresh ideas coming in. So you kind of feel like you're stagnating a little bit. I wanted to focus on hard problems I never had time to work on before. So spend a lot of time working on the I'm curious about ... You don't have time to work on like the cool models that you know you should be working on, but you need like 6 months of like deep thought to actually work on. And the last one is win. Like that's why we're doing this. Winning is fun, it's addictive. And so that was kind of what we wanted to do. And so hopefully with Source Football, I know we're working on the top 3. Hopefully number 4 comes not too far down the line. But like what exactly do we do? So we're a football analytics consultancy. We're really focused on clubs that are in the early part of their analytics journey, and we kind of hope that we can help turbo boost your department. I don't want this to sound like an ad, but this is more of like, what was our thought process of like, how can we add value to the marketplace? The founders, so it's myself, my husband, and our business partner, Cole Grossman. So Cole is a former professional player. So it's really nice to bring in that very unique perspective. My husband and I, even though we had similar roles, him at the Seattle Sounders, myself at Arsenal, those roles were like on paper sound similar. In reality, very, very different parameters in terms of working Premier League, Major League Soccer, team of 15 versus a team of 1.5. But I think for us, like one of the really big things is that it's really about the decisions, not necessarily about the data. So even though it's, how can we turbo boost your analytics department? It's more of like, what's your plan to integrate this into the decision-making process within your club? So kind of setting this up, there were a lot of questions I had around like, what's it like working as like an external consultant versus somebody internal? And I think there's a lot of misconceptions around it. So internally, people think like, well, I can have this great competitive advantage. It's going to stay in the club. I can build IP for the club. These guys are in the building, so they can be part of the conversation. And they can just respond so much faster than an external consultant. Whereas with being like an external consultant, it's like, oh, well, they're going to just like sell their intellectual property to everybody. Like, what competitive advantage do we have? They don't really understand our specific situation because they're doing everything generically. And then what are we going to be left with when the contract ends? And so I have some rebuttals to that. So in terms of competitive advantage, sure, that's great. But like, honestly, how much time do you really have to build competitive advantage? I would say most clubs are just kind of like keeping pace with everyone else. There's not a lot of advantage because you're so busy with these, pre-match, post-match, or I'm curious about ... In terms of building IP for the club, like unless you have somebody really kind of sharp thinking about this, more likely than not, the code is just sitting on someone's laptop, and when they leave, it goes out the door, and you're left with nothing. Yep, that still happens in 2023, which is like depressing. Being in the building part of the conversation, that's great, that's an advantage, but there's also the downside that you are subject to groupthink. You get hyper-focused on, some of the points that the coaching staff is making that aren't necessarily really that important, so you kind of lose the forest for the trees. And then in terms of being able to respond quickly, like, yeah, but you also get distracted and bogged down by so many ad hoc requests. In terms of us specifically, with competitive advantage, like I had up there before that I want to win. Selling our kind of like platform to everybody doesn't really help you do that. Like, yeah, sure, like if we sell to every single team in a league, one of them's going to win. That's great, but that's not satisfying to me personally. That's not what motivates me. So we just work with a limited number of partners. We have exclusive deals for a lot of leagues. In terms of understanding the situation, like your situation isn't actually that unique. There's kind of like a lot of like foundational principles around your team and your league that we already know about, but we can also ramp up really quickly. But I think one of the really valid points is like, yeah, when the contract ends, like you're not left with much. But same with your data scientist that goes out the door with all the code. So how are we kind of helping with some of these big problems? So because we're not kind of like bogged down with like the day-to-day of like post-match, pre-match delivery, ad hoc questions, we have a lot more time to think about some of these hard problems in terms of like validating new data sources. You also benefit from like shared costs. So like if one of our clients cares about a data provider called Skill Corner, we do that analysis once, and then we can share it with everyone, which is kind of nice. So that's the benefit of working across multiple clubs. And then we've done so much of this that like now we understand how to merge and get the best value out of all these data sources. In terms of the competition getting smarter, you get to kind of benefit from all of our knowledge rather than starting from scratch. And then again, have the time and space to work on these hard problems. So, building kind of more complex models with tracking data, you don't have a lot of time to do that once you're in the building, whereas we have time to do that. We get to advise on strategy, best practices. We can deliver infrastructure. We don't have a great solution for the real data limitations. Like that's just like a reality of how the sport operates, unfortunately. So like unless people figure out how to get soccer players to play 162 matches a season, kind of out of luck there. But I think like really kind of like the big one that I'll end with is how do you turn all of this information into better decision making? And so that's where I think we add a lot of value. I'm not going to go too much into it, but just know that like we're not really like we kind of say like, yeah, we're going to turbo boost your analytics department, but it's not just about your department. It's the holistic view of how does your football club make decisions. And I think within the analytics community, we love to say trust the process, but you need to have a process in order to trust it. And so that's kind of the reality of where we are with football clubs is that they want to build something, but they don't understand what's the process to actually incorporate that into decision making. So with that, I think I'm just about out of time, but yeah, thank you everyone.
All right, we're going to take a couple minutes for questions before we get to break. So, and I will pass the microphone around to our esteemed PhD student, Kwong Wen.
So let's say, is this on? Can you hear me? Okay. So let's say that I am a student and I want to get started in soccer analytics. What database or what website would I go to get started to get some data to play with?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of companies that will offer like free data sorts. So they'll put up like a GitHub repository with maybe like a season or a couple seasons worth of data. So I know StatsBomb does this, Skill Corner does this as well. And then there's another website called ftbl. They have a lot of data there that if you have good technical skills, you can get access to. I'm not going to recommend anything, but it's a good place to, I think, get started. Thank you.
When you started at Arsenal, did you get buy-in pretty quickly from, manager or scouts, et cetera, people who were, were supposed to use what you were outputting to make decisions, or did it take a lot of time, or did you hear doubts? Obviously, I'm not asking you to badmouth anybody at Arsenal, but just curious.
No, I think that's like a very valid question. So I think there's kind of like two parts of that. So we were brought in at kind of like a very high level. So Ivan Gazidis was one of the people driving the decision to bring us in, but with Arsene Wenger's kind of like blessing. That doesn't mean that Wenger fully trusted us or was like, I'm going to make decisions only based on this information from day one. There was still a lot of work to do where I think he was like, oh, this is interesting, but I've been making decisions this way. I've been really successful doing it this way. I need a while to get comfortable with what you're doing. And so we had to do a lot of work in terms of not just like, here are the numbers, but here's the video, and this is how those numbers are reflected in what you're seeing. And so that took a really long time. And honestly, the early conversations were like, why is this number of shots so high? There were only 5 shots, but there were 3 headers. And so there wasn't even agreement on like how do you define a shot. So yeah, it takes a really long time to kind of get that buy-in. But I think, you know, the nice thing is that having that support from high up, people were pretty willing to get there. It was just how much do we trust it and when.
Very good time. Last question before break.
So I think like within soccer, a lot of people when they're like evaluating players, they have like trouble like balancing how would you like prioritize like statistics or using like eye tests, for example, to watch players. So how would you say you should balance that when like evaluating a player's performance?
This is something that like shifts, I think, over my career. I would say that like at least with statistics, like we know really well like what they're good at, what they're poor at. You know, are those things important? That's something that we can kind of like validate and prove. Whereas I think with scouting, like they are seeing things that we can't, but there's no concept of like, is that something that's important? So I personally would gear much more towards relying on the data. It doesn't mean exclusively rely on the data, and certainly there's positions that I really wouldn't rely on the data more than others. Center back is the big one. But yeah, I think, you know, we're really good at that. I think where scouts are hopefully adding value is all of the factors that contribute to what is this player capable of doing versus what they're being asked to do. That's something that the data really can't answer because we can only see what the player is being asked to do. So, you know, does this player have kind of the skills and the attributes to perform in a different system than what we're seeing them in?
All right, so before we switch over to the break, we have some CMU swag for our keynote speaker, Sarah. So next time you're at the pitch, you know, it's cold weather, you can rock some CMU Stats fleece and hat. All right, we're going to switch over to break time now, and we'll be back here at 10 a.m. Let's thank Sarah for the great job.